Hey all, and welcome back to another episode of There's Danger Here. I'm Leilani,
And I'm Sam.
and today we're going to talk about a pretty famous experiment that was once used as the golden standard. Um, and this experiment can be a necessary part of science. It's how hypotheses are proved or disproved. And for this case, scientific methodology, the goal, the experiment examined how situational variables affect people's behavior and reactions. The method, psychology professor Philip Zimbardo led a team that recruited 24 male students from the local community. The students were randomly assigned to be prisoners or guards in a mock prison in the basement of a university psychology building. The guards were given uniforms and told to prevent the prisoners from escaping. Result: the experiment was cut short after 6 days due to the extreme behaviors of the participants. The guards became cruel and sadistic, while prisoners became depressed and hopeless. Zimbardo concluded that the experiment showed how, quote, ordinary college students could do terrible things, end quote. And so, what happens when it all goes wrong, when the ethics of the experiment are non existent? Welcome to the Stanford Experiment.
Ooh, yeah, I remember this one in college psychology class. It was one that I think it's in the 101 class, probably. It's maybe the step above 102
Yeah.
psychology, but I just remember being like, yeah, that makes total sense.
I remember hearing about this a ton, and it's really funny because I had actually started this, um, I was writing about the Stanford Experiment. Bought a couple books about the Stanford Experiment and was, like, reading them to do research, and I talked on the phone with Derek, actually, and he goes, "You know that there's a documentary coming out about this?" I was like, "No, there's what?" I had no idea, no idea, and it was just recently on, like, last week, and I watched it, and of course, I was like, "If they're putting it on now and we've done all this, like, there's a plot twist in here somewhere."
Oh, yeah,
And
for
there
sure.
is. So it's more doctrine than genuine. And when you get to it and you hear the guys talk about it, I'm like, oh my goodness, that makes so much sense
Yeah.
on how this failed so quickly.
Oh, I'm sure
Because
that
6 days doesn't feel like
six
much.
6 days seems really quick. I
Hmm.
mean, I know you're going to get into the detail, but they were they lived there
Hmm.
24/7,
Hmm.
right? So
Yep.
6 days, I guess you do maybe try to take on your environment a little bit. Like I'm trying to think of when I went to volleyball camp or whatever, you start to try to be a little bit like the girls that you're meeting for the first time or
Hmm.
whatever it is, but 6 days is not even a week long
No.
and you've changed your personality.
Yeah.
Seems pretty wild.
Yep. So let's talk about it.
Yeah.
By the time the experiment was set to take place, prisons had become a systemic part of most countries, particularly the US, but had a long history of corruption and brutality, creating more monsters rather than reforming individuals. Again, this is why I wanted to talk about it,
Yeah.
because we're big into the prison things.
Oh, yeah.
By the 1960s, riots plagued the overcrowded prisons in the US. Many were in response to the brutal and inhumane treatment of prisoners. Also, by the late 1960s, America's involvement in Vietnam was at a peak. In the US, the protests for US involvement were underway. Meanwhile, the record numbers of men drafted into the war that they didn't believe in have played a part in the large numbers of those who refused to follow orders or became criminals in the eyes of the military. They were sent to the U.S. Army prison in Long Binh, South Vietnam, where overcrowding and poor treatment led to another riot in August of 1968. By 1970, state and federal lawmakers in America mandated longer sentences for violent and drug offenders.
Mm.
A series of protests in 1970 resulted in confrontations with the Palo Alto Police Department in Stanford. In the altercation, 65 people were injured and many students were arrested. This is when Dr. Philip Zimbardo came in, looking for ways to decrease the tensions that plague the police and students.
You stopped the war on drugs and that
Listen, there's so many pieces to this that
I
all
know.
kind of came together to allow him to do this experiment. And it's crazy to
It's
think
a
about all of these things coming together.
definitely a unique time in our history
Hmm.
right then, for sure. A lot of change happening in our justice system
Hmm.
during that time.
Hmm. And I didn't realize until I read some of this information that some of the guys that either refused to obey orders or whatever were put in South Vietnam, like a prison there. I didn't know that.
I know I was gonna say,
I
like,
had
mention that because I was blown away by that,
mhm.
but then I was like, maybe I just heard you wrong. Like,
No,
that's,
no.
yeah,
So it makes me wonder because I was trying to kind of get into it and I couldn't because I would think that if it was over here and they're like conscientious objectors and stuff like that, then they would have gone to prison here. So I wonder if it was when they were taking orders there because Vietnam was a very weird time
mm-hmm,
where like guys were getting killed very rapidly. So you'd move up the chain of command. And there's a lot of veterans, not to get into this too much, but there's a lot of veteran stories that are frightening where they be like, oh, yeah, a lieutenant told us to do something and we didn't want to. So the lieutenant disappeared and you'll never hear from him again. And
yeah.
like, that's black on black violence. That's very dangerous.
I
Where
mean,
they were just, they're like, yeah, we're not going to do that. And so their leadership, if they gave a bad order and somebody died, well, then they were taken care of too.
yeah, I have a long story of which we won't get into today, but uh, a long lost uncle that just sort of popped up out of nowhere within the last like 10 years.
Hmm.
And he fought in Vietnam and he actually was dishonorably discharged because he had a lieutenant who was 21
Hmm.
and he was 18.
Hmm.
And they said, we're going to go into this village and we're going to do all of these horrible things. And he didn't say no because he was like, I was a boy,
Hmm.
I was a child and I was being led by another child. And so I just listened to him. And then ultimately, I guess, without getting into all the details, things happened that shouldn't have happened when they were there. And that whole
Yeah.
little group of men were dishonorably
Oh,
discharged.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Stuff like that happens throughout history,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
All right, back to this. In 1971, a new police chief entered Palo Alto, Captain James Zurcher, and he reached out to Zimbardo, and the two encouraged student and police interactions to be in a more positive light. So, what they did is they set up tours of the police building. Police and students had meals together in restaurants and local areas, and this resulted in decreased tensions between the two populations. Also in 1971, Zimbardo realized that the U.S. Office of Naval Research offered a grant to conduct research on transforming imprisonment of individuals. So he set about determining what happens when good people are sent to bad places,
Mm-hmm.
essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Zimbardo created a prison within the basement of one of the university buildings under the advice of Carlo Prescott, who was an inmate that had recently been released from San Quentin after serving 17-year sentence, and started screening over 100 applicants for this.
I didn't realize they built a prison.
Sort of. It was like a mock prison. So
Right.
there's videos of it, and it's,
I always thought they used like a real prison though somewhere that was like
mm-mm.
not functional anymore or
No. So it was in the basement, and it was very crudely set up, but they set up kind of mock walls. We'll talk about it in just a minute, but it's not
huh.
anything super exciting or
It also that
excessive,
yeah,
but
it also
it was
brings
only
the
for a 2-week experiment.
yeah. I know, just it I can see how someone could get like overwhelmed in like a real prison.
Yeah,
But then when you're thinking like, oh, but there's cubicle walls or whatever,
basically that's what it
right?
was. Yeah.
Like it just again is so strange that it would
Hmm.
turn so badly so quick.
Yeah. So at first, he worked with Captain Zurcher, wanting to use the police rookies to be the guards rather than these college students. However, Zurcher realized he couldn't give up that many officers for 2 weeks, and so all participants were going to be students instead. For a sum of $15 a day, males would be either a prisoner or a guard for 2 weeks. The 100 was cut down to about 75, and then all of those 75 applicants were put through a lengthy psychological assessment. Other key information was that they could never have been in jail or prison before, so
Hmm.
that they didn't have knowledge
Mm-hmm.
of the environment, and that they couldn't leave the experiment unless it was medically necessary.
Oh,
Hmm. Which becomes a thing.
yeah.
The 75 were whittled down to the 24 after the assessments. From there, the men were randomly assigned to either guards or prisoners. Zimbardo said that he flipped a coin to determine who received which assignment. So you just heads or tails, you're a guard or
Hmm.
you're an inmate. And there was much less inmates there. I think there was 9. The rest were guards because they worked 8-hour shifts.
Oh, okay.
Guards were sent to the surplus store to get assignment uniforms, including a club, sunglasses, and a khaki uniform. And the experiment officially started August 15th, 1971.
Did they have to pay for their own uniforms? Like they
I don't
ultimately
think
just
so.
come
I
out
think,
negative
yeah,
after this experiment?
no, I think they had like a stipend
Yeah.
and they were like, here's this money, go get this stuff from the surplus
Hmm.
stores.
Only 9 inmates. I like forgot that it was just 24 people who did this.
hmm
It just feels like you would need so many more to like really get a grasp on.
Well, the space that they were using
I
was not
know.
very big
I know they were
either,
using a
so.
basement.
hmm So, unbeknownst to most, and I think this isn't publicized very often, but this was kind of highlighted in the recent documentary. Prior to the official day 1, the guards were given a full day of training,
Oh.
and that's never talked about. So they were told what to do and how to act. Zimbardo was telling guards to make the inmates feel powerless. Examples of how to control people that were the inmates, and these examples, quote unquote examples, were used almost to the letter of what he said to do.
Hmm.
However, no physical violence was allowed to occur. Among the guards was a kid named Ken Cotter, who, after listening to the information on day 0, decided he didn't want to do it. Ken felt like they were being pushed into a certain way of acting, which felt insincere. And so he was like, I'm not
Hmm.
participating in this. This is acting. This isn't an actual experiment.
Right. I mean, at the same time, prison guards are going to get training. So they should have, if I were to go back in hindsight, do this again, I would say they should have like had someone who actually trains prison guards come in and train them in a very condensed version.
hmm
Like maybe not give them scripts
Yeah.
like of this is what you should say and whatnot. But like, if a inmate asked to leave his cell or whatever, and you have to whatever it is, get 2 guards or,
hmm
just give them a brief training on like the policies and procedures that you're
hmm
gonna expect them to do. But um I think some training is necessary, but it's the like
I think it was more that the scripting and that they
yeah,
used exactly what the scripting said as the punishments that they end up doling out later. Because really, their only information, it wasn't that they're supposed to be these good professional guards. It was that, like, this is your job. You're supposed to watch these guys. Don't let them escape.
yeah,
Those are your rules. That's supposed to be the rules of the experiment.
right,
It wasn't supposed to be, inflict punishment or, try and break them
right.
mentally.
Mind control
Mm-mm.
and yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
Because they wanted to see how people would act in power, in positions of
right,
power versus powerless,
right.
essentially. Um, oh, like I just said. So Zimbardo was telling the guards to make the inmates feel powerless. Let's see what else. The guards, unlike prisoners, served 8-hour shifts and got to go home after each shift, whereas the inmates stayed the full
Mhm.
time. They thought that that would be more realistic. And in addition, David Jaffe, an undergraduate who had completed a project on the psychology of imprisonment, was designated as a warden. The superintendent of this quote unquote prison was, of course, played by none other than Philip Zimbardo, so he was there the whole time. During day 0, the guards also came up with 17 rules in which included addressing the inmates by their assigned numbers rather than their names, that they had to be silent during meals, and addressing the guards as, quote, Mr. Correctional Officer, end quote. And those are just a few of the
Mhm.
17, obviously. Those that were prisoners were, quote unquote, arrested on the start of day 1, and they were picked up by real police officers and
Oh,
taken to jail as part of cooperation with Captain Zurcher in order to make the experiment feel more real.
okay, that's fun.
So they were pretend charged with either like robbery or
Uh-huh.
arson, but they had like an actual crime that they were being told that they committed to be in this experiment. They were frisked put in handcuffs, and taken to the real jail,
Right.
like actual
Yeah.
jail. At the station, they were fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding cell.
Holy cow.
Yeah. So there's one point in the documentary, and it's the Stanford Experiment. Unlocking the Truth is the name of
Uh-huh.
this documentary, where one of the prisoners, he was like, I didn't realize that I was going to be arrested on day one. And it was actual police officers that come into your house, knocking on the door, putting you in cuffs in front of everybody. And he said that he just wanted to scream out to the neighborhood, like, this is just an experiment.
Right.
This isn't real.
It's not
Like,
real.
not really getting arrested, which that's fair. This,
100% fair.
like, well, that's embarrassing. I
You
signed up
better
for this
hope that
experiment.
like the rumors are that your friends can spread as like that was fake are stronger than the rumors that crazy old Karen next door is like, hey, he got
Arrested.
arrested.
Yep.
Like,
I'm like, how? Oh, that's
I
terrible.
know. Also, you're getting put in the system.
Hmm.
You're getting a mugshot. You're getting your fingerprints. Who knows if they keep them or not?
I don't
But
think they did. And it was in the 70s, so it's not electronic.
yeah, I guess
Everything's
it's a little
paper.
different. Yeah. Okay.
So when the experiment was ready, they were then blindfolded and taken to the prison location, which was in the basement of Jordan Hall. From there, they were stripped and searched, deloused, and given smocks with the numbers that assigned them.
Mm,
Mhm. They were also given a nylon to put over their head to simulate having shaved heads, which I didn't look up to see if they used to shave their heads in prison, but they don't now.
right.
At least most states don't. I don't know. In
It seems like a silly detail.
Yeah. In Texas, there is, like, if you look up their death row inmates, all of them have shaved heads. So I think when they first arrived, they might actually still get their head shaved, but I don't think every state does it. And I thought that's a weird thing to do. But again, a lot of these guys were, it's the 70s, so they have long hair and
Right.
hippie
Right.
style, and they talk about bringing drugs in and stuff like that and smoking weed and trying to have a good time at first.
Uh-huh.
So maybe that was to try and show like the institutionalized part of it. They also were given rubber
Hmm.
sandals, and a chain was placed around one of their ankles. At this time, they weren't attached to each other. It was just like a chain. I was like, that is another odd detail. Why?
It, yeah, it seems like it's taking the like controlled aspect of it out of the like that could it seems it's a power play, right? It's to remind them that they're the prison, like they're the prisoner.
Yeah, it's
But
just so
it's so
strange.
silly. It
Yeah.
is.
There were 3 prison cells that were 10 feet by 12 feet, equipped with beds and bars on the doors, and that's about it. They had a designated yard space that was 9 feet by 40 feet long, which housed the only actual entrance or exit from the quote unquote prison.
Hmm.
There was a hole, so an isolation cell that was previously a storage closet, and there were still like shelves in the storage closet, so it was a very tiny space. That
Oh my
was,
God.
yeah, that was their hole
It's
that they
like
had
the
put people in.
Chokey from Matilda.
Yes, essentially. It was. They created it.
Yeah.
Officers for the warden and the regular guards were made. The only actual toilet had to be accessed through the yard because they can't make toilets for
Right.
this
Right.
basement area. The hallway had a false wall at the end, which housed a camera so that everything in the hallway was recorded, and an intercom system was added to allow guards to broadcast messages to the cells in the yard, doubling as a recording device for those areas as well. So
Hmm.
everything is recorded throughout. One of the guards, Dave, decided to take over as kind of the head guard, and he ended up being called John Wayne. He
Oh
took
God.
the inmates out and ran them through drills and things that he thought would be embarrassing. At first, the inmates were laughing and going along with it, and Dave said that he was inspired by this from being hazed in his maternity or his
Oh,
fraternity,
uh-huh.
excuse me,
Yeah.
earlier that year. But Zimbardo had given guards a script of how to act and what rules they could have, and many of the guards thought that they were proving that prisons were a horrible place, and so they played roles to prove that it was a horrible place,
Uh,
because that's how it was handed to them. Dave was of a theater background and thought that he should play a mean guard, so he did what he could to show it. Chuck Burton described or decided to try and be Dave's sidekick, so he was another guard that was there, and he ordered around the inmates trying to make them feel bad. Chuck was small in stature his entire life, made worse when he was skipped a year ahead, he said. And so during this experiment, it was like the first time he got to feel
Like a
powerful.
big man.
Hmm.
I mean, I am hearing this, like, thinking critically for the first time, honestly, and it's like, yeah, okay, it's gotta fail.
Of course it does.
Yeah, because it's, they're acting, as we've been saying,
Yeah.
like, prison guards do not go into their office and sit in their lunchroom and go, "Hey, I'm gonna be the mean guard today, and can you be my sidekick?
Hmm.
I'm gonna go by John Wayne. I've got this backstory," like, and you just, like, workshop these characters, like,
Yeah.
yeah, sure, maybe there are people like that,
Yeah.
but you're not, like, attempting to be that. It's, like,
Hmm.
innate in your
Hmm.
personality and who you are, but
Yeah. And I think the guy who plays this John Wayne character, he got the nickname because he had like a southern accent that he picked up for this role. Like he didn't even.
oh, man,
But again,
it's
that's
the
not
role of
how
a
it was.
lifetime for him.
Yeah, that's not how it was presented to society. It was presented as a
Right,
blind study,
right,
not that they were being told things in the background. And many of these kids afterwards, the guards, they said that if they weren't doing enough, they were like, they were taken into the back by the warden or the superintendent. And they're like, "You're not really participating."
right,
I'm like,
like,
oh,
amp it up a
yeah.
bit.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Without completely just all out saying, like, you need to do this. And again, it was like the Vietnam area. And so the guys really thought that they were trying to prove that prisons were a horrible system. And so that's
mhm,
what they were doing. They were
right.
playing a part.
Mm.
Um, Again, not all the officers acted the way Zimbardo wanted. John, one of the boys, um, he would bring in joints and he tried to lighten up the situation. And he was taken aside by Zimbardo's assistant again and told that others could see that he wasn't acting tough, that he was just on the sideline. So he was told that all of the guards needed to act worse to see what that does to innocent people.
Oh my gosh.
Hmm.
I'm just trying to remember, like,
This is not what we were
I
told
was gonna
back
say
in
I was gonna
college.
say
None of that
it
was brought up.
wouldn't be shocking if, like, I just didn't pay attention to the part of the lesson at the end where they're like, "Turns out that this was all just a bunch of crap." But, I don't remember any of that. I just remember being told, "This is a study that proves that when you
Hmm.
put someone in a powerful position, they just all of a sudden take on that role,
Hmm.
and they are convinced that that's who they are. And then if you tell someone you're like the low end of the stick there, and you're like, they're gonna believe it, and they're gonna become that." And
Hmm.
I just was like, "Whoa,
Yeah,
that's
that's
incredible! What a like, duh!" Like it just made sense to you. But now it's funny. I'm like, man, I either really just tuned that part out that this is all just like
mm,
bullshit,
yeah.
or this is all new
It's all new.
information.
It's
Yeah.
all new information. Doug, one of the inmates, thought he was going to get his school books in order to keep up with his studying during
Mm.
this time, but they did not, obviously. And he got irritated after a while with the shenanigans of the guards, so he started getting the inmates to think of ways to act out and get back at the guards. One man said that he realized that the doors opened inwards, so he convinced everyone to block the doors with their
Oh
mattresses
my
to just
God.
like get back. They're like, "All right, well,
Right.
you're gonna make us do push-ups and ridiculous things. Well, you
Right.
can't even come in my room."
Yeah.
The guards, who were meant to maintain order, then had to take the mattresses and the beds, and they ripped all of their so the inmates like ripped all their numbers off and threw them into the hallway, and they're like, "We're not doing this." And in response, the guards took their smocks, meaning that the men were now naked.
Oh my
So
gosh.
it did get ridiculous really fast because they didn't know how to maintain order because they're
Yeah.
just college kids.
They're college kids who, like, as the prisoner, you're in this experiment and
Yeah.
you start to realize, like, oh, that guy who I is in my study hall is now talking in a Texas accent and like calling himself John Wayne. This is all ridiculous.
Yeah.
So let's make this more
Fun.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were
Like,
making it fun,
yeah.
basically. Yep. So in response to this, they were then chained and like by pairs with their ankles using those chains. So now they're like two by two.
Naked stuff.
Yep. Still naked.
Oh my
So this
God.
is when they found that there were screw loose in the sockets in their cells. So they slowly like were undoing these
Oh,
screws, one of the guys said, and he used it to unlock their prison doors in an
oh,
attempt to quote unquote escape.
escape.
Yeah. So they were like, all right, well, let's get out of here. And they were caught and put back in their cells.
My God.
Yep.
Okay, now the 6 days is starting to make more sense.
Yep. Because it ramped up so
Oh, yeah.
fast. One of the inmates began incessantly banging on the door. One of the guards found a fire extinguisher and used it to push the inmate back. So he actually, and he thought it was hilarious. He thought it was like funny and not serious at all. But he definitely set the fire extinguisher off on one of the
Oh
inmates.
my
And I was
God.
like, he definitely doesn't know how an extinguisher works then, but okay. And Doug, one of the inmates, the one that thought that he was going to get the school books, thought that this was getting ridiculous and
Yeah.
was like ready to go home. He's like, I'm not going to get my studying done. Everybody's acting a fool. This isn't fun anymore. Like, how do I leave? Can I leave now? Well, if you remember in the
He has to
beginning,
have a medical emergency.
medical
Oh my God.
necessity, right?
That's when you start faking a seizure.
So that's when Zimbardo pulled Doug out and told him that he was the leader of the rebellion and he definitely couldn't leave because it was making things exciting in
Oh,
there. Of this, Doug says that he started to feel bad about everything that was happening. So when he was sent back in, Doug was sent to the hole for his actions and he was thrown in and he pretended to like lose it. I mean, he was like really upset because he realized he wasn't going to be allowed out of this experiment very easily. So he realized he had to act as if he was in real distress in order to get out,
yeah.
and that he had to keep it up in order to be released. And so he like was put in the hole and there's videos of this and he's like screaming and he's like, my skin's on fire and I can't do this and he's just nonstop screaming. And so they brought in Teresa, his girlfriend at the time, and she was also a psychology major. And she was like, nope, he's definitely really having some
Yeah.
issues. He needs to go. And so they finally pulled him out. And she did it because she was like, he clearly doesn't want to be here.
Right. I mean, I'm just thinking, like,
It's
if
like,
my
that's a good
boyfriend,
girlfriend.
yeah, if my boyfriend, like, called me in or I got called into this place that he had agreed to do an experiment and he's sitting there, even if, like, he winks at me, but he's, like, sitting there, like, losing his shit, I would do everything I could to get him out of there.
Yeah,
Be like, oh, yeah,
this is
he,
real. Yeah,
yeah, it's time to go.
yeah.
Um,
So they brought in Clay, a replacement man, and he was sent into the experiment, deloused, given a smock and an ankle chain as well. So they still had their 9
they had their
people.
backup. Yeah,
hmm They had a few backups, it sound like, of both inmates and
it makes sense.
prisoners.
Yeah.
The inmates were then sleep deprived. They were woken up at 2 and then 4, and then the guards would make them do things like push ups and sit ups and sing and do anything else that they could think of for punishment. Because again, this is all hands off stuff that they have to do.
Mm-hmm.
At 6, they were then woken up again for count and instructions from the guards. They had to recite prison rules before beginning more exercises. Clay was a prior merchant marine, and he came in and thought the experiment was absolutely ridiculous.
Oh, yeah.
He was not quite as young as the other guys. And
He was
was
like,
like,
this is so dumb.
yeah. So he thought about, well, how do I get out
Oh,
immediately? And decided on a hunger strike.
there you go.
To which the guards weren't sure how to react. And Clay says at one point they tried to shove food in his mouth, and then at another, they just sling insults at him the whole time. And
Right.
like, I think at one point they're like, I'm going to shove this up your ass if you don't eat it. Like it's going in one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And he's just sitting there, just
Okay.
in it. He looks like he's trying not to laugh. I don't know if he really was like in any sort of way, but he just is just
Uh-huh.
there, like, okay,
Right.
like, what are you going to do
Right.
about this? When that failed, he was also placed in the hole, and the guards had people pound on the door of Clay's cell to try and like bother him so that he didn't get any comfort while he was in the hole.
Oh my God. I
Mhm.
mean, this is pretty wild.
It is.
Like,
It is, and it's not how things would be done in real life, which
no.
I mean is part of the blind part, but you don't know that in the background they're like, amp it up.
Right.
Uh, on the third day, the only thing to change was that visits were added. The prisoners were allowed 1 hour visit time, which was non contact, as if they were in a real prison. After which, the men were chained together and their heads covered with bags. The pretense for this was that they were worried about a potential breakout because everybody was complaining to whoever was visiting, like, this is ridiculous and awful, and I don't want to be here. And so then they thought that somebody was going to come into the basement and break out the guys. And so they actually took them to the fifth floor of Jordan Hall, and they remained there for 3 hours before finally being allowed to
Oh
go back down
my
to the basement.
gosh.
Yeah, at one point it even says that they had dismantled like the basement really quickly to make it look like they had left in case one of their friends did try to break them out. They'd be like, "Oh, well, they're already gone."
Oh my
And then they
God.
had to put it back together and bring them back downstairs.
Oh, I can't even comprehend that. And then it also speaks to like the really lame craftsmanship of this place if they're just taking it down in 3 hours and putting it back up.
Yep.
Like pretty sad.
Yeah. On day 4, another visit was scheduled along with a Catholic priest. The priest arrived in the morning talking with all the prisoners, which of course is recorded. This priest had worked with prisons, like real prisons, before, and Zimbardo likely hoped to keep the simulation as realistic as possible. But at the end of the visitation, he talked about his concern for the actual welfare of the prisoners in this experiment, in which he explained that one of the inmates expressed complaints of constant headaches from the sleep
Right.
deprivation and stuff
Yeah.
like that. The next morning, he went to the hole for refusing to get out of bed, the guy who was complaining of the headaches. And eventually, Zimbardo had him replaced with a reserve prisoner as well. So he was medically deemed that
Yeah.
he needed to leave. So,
I mean, this isn't an experiment so much about like the power dynamics as much as sleep deprivation.
yeah, how they can handle it.
Yeah.
The guards kept trying to think of more and more ways to make the inmates feel less than. So during the night, they were put into sexually inappropriate positions. They made
Oh.
some of the prisoners quote unquote females and others quote unquote males, having the males pretend to sodomize the females.
Oh
So,
my God.
but you think about college age kids and hazing at that
Oh
time,
yeah.
that just seems like a drop in the bucket, which
Yeah.
is sad, but hazing was
It's what yeah.
intense
Yeah.
back then.
Yeah, still can be
It still can
if
be, but
it's
it's not.
in the right college at the right time.
Mhm.
But yeah, that's
And I think that one of the guards, I can't remember for 100%, but I think that one of them, the one that had gone to the fraternity, had had these ideas because of
oh, I'm
the
sure.
hazing.
Yeah.
And so, again, for him, this is college stuff.
Right.
This is them just being dumb.
It is really dumb. It is
Yes.
really dumb. I hate that this was sold to me as like such a
Hmm.
important experiment to learn about.
It was sold to all of us.
I
We were all
know.
fed a lie, but that feels like history.
It does.
So much of history is a
Based on
lie.
yeah.
Or,
Like there was like a whole section of like Psych 102, or actually I think it was like abnormal psychology that we discussed this. Like, and there was like a month and a half worth of like experiments based on this premise.
hmm
And we started with this one.
hmm
And it's like, this is crazy.
I know. I know. Christina, Zimbardo's girlfriend, came down on day 5 and saw what was going on in the background. So he was showing her videos and things that they were doing. And she left just in tears and was like, "This is ridiculous. You guys are doing more harm to these boys than you should." And she
Right.
was like, she said that she was so disappointed. So on day 6, the guards were told to go easy on the prisoners. But by the afternoon, they ended up calling it off, like the whole experiment. Before leaving, he had each prisoner talk to a public defender, and all of them voiced the same complaints that they had poor and inadequate food, disturbed sleep, and abusive behavior by the guards. All of the participants, both guards and prisoners, were then asked to complete a short survey at the conclusion.
And that's what we have based years and years of textbooks on.
Yes.
Is their short survey at the
Yeah.
conclusion.
Yeah. After that, Zimbardo became a subject matter expert on how prisons affect people because of
Ah,
how they had portrayed this
that's
experiment.
crazy.
And they didn't, it sounds like they didn't release all of the transcripts and things that would prove that this was such a faked experiment. It doesn't come out later till a journalist looks at this and is like, wait a minute. And that's how this whole, the whole documentary got started, is because somebody came in and was looking at the actual transcripts and some of the information, and I was like, this is fake. This is a
Yeah.
fake experiment. This was made up.
Yeah.
And it was like, people should know that this is made up because we've been basing
So much.
Years and years, decades
Yeah.
on this.
So
So,
much weight has been put on this.
yeah. So before that, as a result, people looked at him when other egregious acts were found, such as the Attica uprising that happened 3 weeks after the Stanford Prison Experiment and kind of proved Zimbardo's point. So, where this may have just been a theoretical and kept in academia, suddenly it was thrust into the limelight and it made great marketing for Dr. Zimbardo.
Mm-hmm.
After this, it was generally believed that he was the informed figure and looked to for decades as a resource. So, the Attica, let's talk about that. In 2000, the 2000 inmate prison in Attica, New York had reached a boiling point. A riot occurred after complaints that the guards treated them like quote unquote beasts when unanswered. The inmates took more than 40 members of the staff hostage for 4 days. On the fourth day, state police and guards stormed in, causing multiple deaths. One guard and 3 inmates were killed by the rioting inmates. Another 9 guards and 30 prisoners were killed when the police and guards tried to reclaim the prison.
Mm.
So, and after this, of course, Zimbardo's like, see, I just proved in an experiment that this was going to happen. And then it happens in real life. And the world is like shook.
Yeah.
Like, yep.
Like, this is what you get when
Yeah.
you put just normal men in power positions.
Yeah.
Like,
So and it just happened to happen right at the right time
oh my
for
God.
Zimbardo.
If I were to be a conspiracy theorist,
Which, okay.
I mean, there'd be part of me that says, oh, he staged that. He
Yeah.
told them to do it. Like, he infiltrated that prison and said, I need you to
Okay,
do this.
that's a reach.
I know. It's just, the money's on the line.
I know.
People do some weird stuff.
Yeah. This was followed by President Nixon's war on drugs, resulting in mandatory minimum sentences added to the already booming numbers of incarcerated individuals.
Yeah, that worked out great.
In the 1970s, when the Stanford Experiment took place, approximately 300,000 people were incarcerated. By 2002, the numbers of incarcerated people in the U.S. exceeds 2 million.
Whoa. Holy cow. I don't think I've ever heard that before.
Yeah.
Like, I have 100%, I knew we have the most incarcerated individuals of any nation, or like really anywhere on this planet, like developed,
Mm-hmm.
maybe even undeveloped. And I knew that the war on drugs created a huge influx of that, but I did not know we went from 300,000 to over 2 million
And that
in
was in 2002. And so, I mean, overcrowding has continued. So I didn't look up a recent numbers, but I can guarantee you it's more than that.
It blows my mind that we didn't just, like, until recently start waving the flag of, like, maybe we don't incarcerate everyone with drug crimes.
hmm
Like,
And not every state does that.
that is wild to me. I mean, it's a money-making business,
It
right?
is, but
Like,
yeah,
that's
it is.
why, but it's just, I mean, there's so many things involved too.
Oh,
Like,
we'll get into them all eventually on this
yeah,
podcast
yeah.
because you know how I feel about that. In 1973, the American Psychological Association, or APA, reviewed the account of the experiment and outcomes. They concluded that no ethical guidelines had been breached, however, there were remaining concerns. This led to the APA establishing a new set of guidelines in which all proposed psychological experiments must be examined by an institutional review board. In turn, quote, the board would be to consider whether the potential benefits of any research justified the risk of physical or psychological harm to participants, end quote. So they did realize that there was
Well,
something amiss, but it was not unethical, according to them at the time.
I mean, if anything, that's why this is going to be easy to, like, edit into textbooks,
hmm
because that standard came to be based on this
hmm
awful play that
hmm
they were trying to write.
Yes. Yeah. Dr. Zimbardo did a PBS series in 1990 called, quote, Discovering Psychology, quote, adding 3 more episodes in 2001. So he tried to make psychology interesting, and he's definitely making money off of being, an expert
Oh, of course.
in the field. When Abu Ghraib detention center in Iraq came to the public's attention for the abuse and torture of detainees in 2003, Zimbardo was on the defense of the U.S. military, specifically Staff Sergeant Frederick. After this, Zimbardo wrote a book called The Lucifer Effect to show how good people do horrific things in the right circumstances. So in this case, he talks about how anybody in, these horrible conditions are going to do terrible things. And so, of course, this good man, is going to torture
Right.
people because he's stuck in terrible conditions.
I mean, there is maybe it's just because I've been brainwashed to think this now, but that's what I'm calling my education in this subject matter is brainwashing.
Hmm.
But there is definitely, it feels like some credibility to the fact that if you were to put one person into a group of like a bunch of people who were all about to go break into cars, it's going to be far less likely for that person who is like, I don't really want to do that to speak up and not do it. Like if you're with 6 or 7 other people and that's like what they're doing.
Hmm.
So I feel like there's some credibility to a study.
I think so. That refers to what is that?
I
The
know
name
that's
of
like
that?
the one
Oh
where
no.
there's like the girl in the uh like down below the apartment when she's getting raped and like everyone assumes that
Yeah,
someone else has called the police so
the
no one
bystander effect or
yeah
whatever.
so like no one does calls the police.
Hmm. And then there's the group think, which is kind of what it sounds like
Right.
you're talking
Yeah.
about. But I think that his premise that any good people put together. So they're saying, me and you, we go
Right.
into a detention center and we have somebody that we're looking after that if we're in this confined environment that you and I, not knowing anything about it, are going to become these horrible human beings. And of
Right.
course, we're going to torture
Right.
them. And of
Right.
course, we're going to do this
Right.
because we just stepped into this environment,
Yeah.
which is asinine. That's
It is
absolutely not the
asinine.
case.
I know. It's hard
There,
for me to think that I ever
yeah,
believed that.
yeah, there are guards that serve 20 years that are amazing. There's guards that serve a year and are horrible human
Right.
beings. It's part of like nature as well. But this was also, they didn't let nature play out. They scripted it. And
Right.
so that's where the fallacy comes into all of this.
Right.
So in 2005, Carlo Prescott, again, that was the inmate that had come in to help, and he stated that he consulted on the experiment. He suggested chaining the prisoners together and having them blindfolded or having bags over their heads when they were moved, all of which occurred on video.
Mm.
So they were doing what the inmate said you could do to torture somebody.
Oh my God.
In 2002, the British Broadcasting Corporation attempted to replicate the study. They had 15 volunteers and assigned them randomly to their roles. Unfortunately, without someone like Zimbardo driving the bus, it didn't happen the way they wanted.
I'm sure it didn't.
The guards weren't cruel, and the study therefore couldn't be replicated. Instead, the guards and prisoners had an amicable relationship. The only similarity was that the experiment was also cut off early, but that was only because the group reorganized into a self governing commune.
Oh my God.
So 100%
Okay.
different.
I want to watch that documentary.
I know, it's like, that's awesome.
Oh, it's amazing. Oh,
Like, we're going to replicate this. And they're like, we're going to get along.
yeah. Turns
Dang it.
out this is can be pretty good.
Yep. So with that, that is the end of the Stanford experiment and how
Wow.
absolutely scripted it was and fake.
It makes me have to like rethink some portions of my life. Like my college years, I'm like, whoa.
You really hinged your life on
I
this?
mean, I was a psych major, so this was like entrenched in like every layer of education that I received.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah, and so like I'm just like, oh man, that really it
So much of your
oh
education
so
incorrect.
yeah. It does make me feel a little more like, yeah, the that college just wants to tell you what it needs to
Yeah.
tell you.
Yeah.
Like, oh man, yikes. Yep, I've got some lifelong thinking to do now, reflecting,
Yeah.
maybe some journaling. No.
Oh, goodness. All right. Well, with that, to everyone out there listening, be careful. It's a dangerous world we live in.